Chapter 1. A Cry in the Wilderness. Sigma 4, a moon draped in an eternal green haze, was a death world only the desperate or foolish dared to explore. Its dense jungles teemed with carnivorous plants, predatory beasts, and airborne toxins that could cripple an unprotected human in moments. Yet, Mason Connors strode through the alien wilderness with practiced ease, his boots crunching against the vibrant foliage as he scanned his surroundings with a handheld bioscanner. This wasn't his first death world, but it was one of the more hostile ones he'd encountered. The midday heat clung to his skin like a second layer, the air thick with the scent of decay and blooming alien flowers. As a former medic for Earth's military, Mason had seen countless battlefields, from frozen wastelands to burning desert outposts. Yet there was something about Sigma, for that unsettled him, a primal hostility that hung heavy in the air, as though the moon itself resented his presence. Mason adjusted his visor, checking the scanner's readings. The device chirped as it analyzed the environment, mapping out the biohazards around him. Venomous vines hung overhead like coiled serpents, their vibrant colors a stark warning to keep his distance. Small, rodent-like creatures skittered through the underbrush, their glowing eyes watching him warily. "This is why they pay me the big bucks," Mason muttered, his voice muffled by the oxygen filter in his helmet. As a planetary surveyor, it was his job to explore and assess planets and moons for potential colonization. Sigma 4 was on the lower end of suitability, but Mason was here to confirm what drones couldn't, whether there was anything of value beneath its hostile exterior. He paused to sip water from his hydration pack, his sharp blue eyes scanning the jungle. That's when he heard a sound that didn't belong. A cry. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling leaves and distant roars of predators, but it stopped Mason in his tracks. He turned, adjusting the audio filters on his helmet. The cry came again, more distinct this time, a wail of pain and desperation, echoing through the jungle. It wasn't human, but it was unmistakably sentient. "What the hell?" Mason whispered, his grip tightening on his plasma pistol. He checked the scanner again, but it offered no answers. Whatever was making the sound was just beyond its detection range. Against his better judgment, Mason followed the noise, his pulse quickening. The cry led him deeper into the jungle, where the trees grew denser and the air thicker. He moved cautiously, his training kicking in as he scanned for threats. His boots sank into the damp soil, and he had to push aside vines and branches that clawed at his gear. The sound grew louder, each cry cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Finally, he reached a small clearing, and what he saw made his breath catch. At the center of the clearing, half buried under a pile of jagged debris, was an alien girl. Her silvery skin shimmered faintly under the sunlight, marred by deep cuts and bruises. Her limbs were tangled unnaturally, and her breathing was shallow. She looked barely alive. Mason's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for signs of danger. The debris around her looked like the remains of a small craft, its once sleek design now twisted and scorched. Smoke rose from the wreckage, the acrid smell of burning metal filling the air. The girl stirred weakly, her head turning toward him. Her violet eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. They were filled with fear and pain, but also a flicker of something else, hope. Hey, it's okay," Mason said softly, kneeling beside her. He set his pistol aside and reached for his medkit, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl flinched as he approached, her lips moving faintly. Her voice was weak, and her words were in an alien tongue, but Mason recognized the universal plea. "Don't hurt me." Mason held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm a medic," he said, knowing she likely couldn't understand him. "I can help." He opened the medkit and began assessing her injuries. Her silvery skin was warm to the touch, and beneath it, her blood had a faint bluish tint. She had several deep lacerations, likely from the crash, and her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Mason worked quickly, using the medkit's advanced tools to stabilize her. The girl winced as he applied a regenerative foam to her wounds, but she didn't resist. The foam hissed softly as it sealed the cuts, the nanites within it beginning the process of repairing tissue. Mason splinted her leg with a portable cast, his movements efficient and practiced. As he worked, he couldn't help but study her. She was young, barely an adult by human standards, and her delicate features gave her an almost ethereal appearance. Her silvery skin seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and her violet eyes were unlike anything Mason had ever seen. Despite her injuries, there was a strength in her gaze that impressed him. "Who did this to you?" Mason asked, though he doubted she could understand him. The girl's lips moved again, forming faint syllables. Her voice was too weak to be coherent, but one word stood out: Aberai. Mason frowned. He didn't know what it meant, but it sounded like a name or a group. He glanced around the clearing, his instincts on high alert. Whoever or whatever had done this to her might still be nearby. "Don't worry," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm going to get you out of here." He lifted her carefully, cradling her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her fragile frame trembling slightly. The girl's head rested against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. As Mason carried her back through the jungle, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And who or what were the Aberai? The journey back to his ship was arduous, every step a challenge as Mason navigated the treacherous terrain. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, her soft murmurs the only sounds breaking the jungle's oppressive silence. When they finally reached the ship, Mason breathed a sigh of relief. The sleek vessel stood like a beacon of hope amid the hostile wilderness. He carried the girl aboard and placed her gently on a cot in the medbay. "Juniper," Mason said, addressing the ship's AI. "I need a full scan of her condition. Unknown species." "Understood," Juniper replied, her voice calm and clinical. "Scanning now." Mason watched as the medbay's scanners moved over the girl, their soft hum filling the room. The screen displayed complex readouts, most of which Mason couldn't decipher. "Species, unknown," Juniper reported. "Genetic markers suggest a hybridized physiology. Severe trauma detected. Prognosis, critical without sustained care." "Do whatever you can for her," Mason said firmly. As Juniper began administering treatment, Mason sat beside the cot, watching the girl. Her breathing steadied, and some of the tension left her body as the ship's advanced medical systems worked to stabilize her. "You're safe now," Mason murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The girl's eyes opened briefly, and for the first time, there was a hint of trust in her gaze. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing against his hand. "Kalari," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mason's brow furrowed. "Kalari," he repeated. "Is that your name?" The girl nodded faintly before her eyes closed again. Mason leaned back, his mind racing. Kalari. Aberai. The words meant little to him now, but he had a feeling they were the key to understanding what had happened to her, why she'd been left for dead. As the ship hummed softly around them, Mason vowed to protect her, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. Escape from Sigma 4. The medbay lights hummed softly as Mason leaned back in the chair beside Kalari's cot. Her breathing had steadied, her silvery skin no longer pale and ashen, but regaining a faint iridescent glow. Juniper's scanners projected a holographic display over her body, showing the internal injuries still mending. The advanced nanites had worked wonders, but Kalari was far from fully recovered. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He'd seen too many people succumb to injuries like hers during his years as a combat medic. Watching her fight for her life stirred something deep inside him, an instinct, a need to protect, and a simmering anger at whoever had left her in this state. "Juniper, any updates?" he asked. "Subject Kalari's vital signs are stabilizing," Juniper replied. "However, genetic markers indicate incompatibility with some of the ship's medical treatments. Full recovery will require time and specific resources." Mason rubbed his temples. "Great. Just what I needed on a death world." Kalari stirred on the cot, her violet eyes fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented, before her gaze locked onto Mason. Her lips moved, forming soft syllables Mason couldn't understand. Her hand twitched, weakly gesturing toward her chest. "Hey, take it easy," Mason said, leaning closer. "You're safe. You're on my ship." Her fingers brushed the glowing area on her chest, her expression pained. "Aberai," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mason frowned. The word again. It had to mean something important. "Who are the Aberai? Are they the ones who did this to you?" Kalari's eyes filled with tears as she nodded faintly. She tried to speak again, but the effort left her coughing, her delicate frame trembling with exertion. Mason placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "Don't push yourself," he said gently. "We'll figure this out." Kalari's gaze lingered on him, a mix of gratitude and fear in her eyes. Mason could only imagine what she had been through, and the thought made his jaw tighten. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble he'd stumbled into, but he wasn't about to abandon her. As if to confirm his fears, the ship's alarms blared suddenly, the shrill sound slicing through the medbay. "Proximity alert," Juniper announced. "Multiple vessels approaching. Rodhack signatures detected." Mason's blood ran cold. Rodhacks? What the hell are they doing here? Kalari's eyes widened in terror. She sat up abruptly, despite her injuries, and pointed toward the viewport. Her voice came in frantic bursts of her alien language, her gestures unmistakable. "Danger is coming." Mason swore under his breath and rushed to the cockpit. The ship's scanners displayed 3 incoming vessels, their trajectories closing in fast. Rodhack's ships were unmistakable, sleek, angular, and bristling with weapons. Mason had encountered them once during his military career and barely lived to tell the tale. "They must have been tracking her," Mason muttered, his hands flying over the controls. "Juniper, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're not equipped for a fight." "Affirmative," Juniper replied. "Rodhack's vessels will intercept in 2 minutes." Kalari appeared in the doorway, clutching the frame for support. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Mason turned to her, his voice firm but not unkind. "You need to stay in the medbay," he said. "This is going to get rough." Kalari shook her head, pointing to the viewport and then to herself. She pressed her hand to her chest, where the faint glow pulsed beneath her skin. "They're after you," Mason said, realization dawning. "You're carrying something they want, aren't you?" Kalari nodded, her lips trembling. She spoke a single word, clear and desperate: "Key." Mason didn't have time to process the implications. The Rodhack ships were closing in, their weapons systems lighting up on his scanner. He gripped the controls tightly, his pulse pounding in his ears. "All right, Juniper," he said. "Let's show these bastards what this ship can do." The Rodhacks opened fire, and the ship shuddered as Mason executed a hard roll to evade the incoming blasts. The jungle moon's atmosphere lit up with streaks of plasma, the dense clouds flashing with each explosion. Mason pushed the ship to its limits, weaving through the treacherous terrain with practiced precision. "Kalari, hold on to something," he shouted as the ship dove toward a narrow canyon. The Rodhack's fighters pursued relentlessly, their smaller, more agile frames giving them the advantage. "Juniper, divert power to the aft shields," Mason ordered. "Deploy countermeasures." A cluster of flares erupted behind the ship, momentarily blinding the Rodhack's pilots. Mason used the opportunity to gain some distance, his hands moving instinctively over the controls. The canyon walls blurred past, the ship's sensors screaming warnings about the tight space. Kalari clung to the co-pilot's seat, her eyes wide as she watched Mason maneuver. Despite the chaos, there was something awe-inspiring about his focus. Every move was calculated, every risk weighed against the odds. It was clear he'd done this before and survived. The Rodhack's fighters adjusted quickly, splitting into a pincer formation to cut off Mason's escape. Juniper's voice chimed in calmly, as though they weren't moments from annihilation. "Hostile vessels closing to optimal firing range. Recommend immediate action." "Yeah, no kidding," Mason muttered. He glanced at Kalari. "You might want to close your eyes for this." He pulled the ship into a steep climb, the engines screaming in protest. The Rodhack's fighters followed, their weapons charging for another volley. At the last moment, Mason inverted the ship and dove straight down, skimming the canyon floor. The sudden maneuver forced the Rodhack's fighters to adjust, and one of them clipped the canyon wall, exploding in a fiery burst. "One down," Mason said, his lips twitching into a grim smile. "2 to go." The remaining fighters pressed the attack, their plasma blasts narrowly missing Mason's ship. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of overheating systems, and Mason knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. "Juniper, reroute power to the forward railgun," he said. "Let's see if we can even the odds." "Railgun charging," Juniper replied. "Target locked." Mason lined up the shot, his fingers hovering over the trigger. The Rodhack's fighter surged into view, its weapons flaring ominously. Mason fired, and the railgun discharged with a deafening crack. The projectile tore through the enemy ship, reducing it to a cascade of debris. Kalari let out a startled gasp, her hands gripping the seat tightly. Mason spared her a glance, his expression softening. "We're not out of this yet," he said. The final Rodhack's fighter broke off, retreating into the upper atmosphere. Mason watched it go, his body tense. He knew this wasn't the end. The Rodhacks didn't give up easily, and if they were after Kalari, they'd be back with reinforcements. "Juniper, plot a course to the nearest neutral outpost," Mason said. "We need to get off this moon and figure out what's going on." "Course plotted," Juniper replied. "Engaging warp drive." The ship shuddered as it accelerated, leaving Sigma for behind. Mason slumped back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. Kalari reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice faint but filled with emotion. Mason gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now. Let's keep it that way." As the stars streaked past the viewport, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were only just beginning. Chapter 3, Hunted. The tranquil hum of the warp drive filled the cockpit, a deceptive contrast to the chaos that had consumed the last few hours. Mason leaned against the console, his gaze fixed on the streaking stars outside. His pulse was only just beginning to settle, though his mind remained in overdrive. The Rodhacks weren't just after Kalari, they wanted whatever she carried. And whatever it was valuable enough for them to risk pursuing her across a death world and into human territory. Kalari sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The glow beneath her chest pulsed faintly, a rhythmic reminder of the mystery they were entangled in. Her violet eyes, wide with a mix of fear and determination, darted around the cockpit. Despite the obvious strain she was under, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that Mason found admirable. "You doing okay?" Mason asked, breaking the silence. Kalari hesitated before nodding. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Sorry. "For what?" Mason asked, frowning. She gestured toward the viewport, where the Rodhack ships had pursued them not long ago. Her meaning was clear. She blamed herself for dragging Mason into her mess. "Don't apologize," Mason said firmly. "This isn't your fault. Whatever those bastards are after, it doesn't give them the right to do this to you." Kalari's lips trembled as she tried to respond, her limited grasp of the human language frustrating her. Finally, she placed her hand over her chest, where the glow pulsed faintly, and said a single word, "Key." Mason studied her intently. "You said that earlier. What kind of key? A physical key? A data key?" Kalari shook her head and tapped her chest again. "Inside me." Mason's eyes narrowed. "It's implanted in you?" She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, she looked impossibly fragile, her silvery skin and slender frame giving her an almost ethereal appearance. Mason could see the weight of her burden in every line of her face. "Okay," he said, his tone softer now. "Let's start from the beginning. Who are you, and why are the Rodhacks after you?" Kalari took a shaky breath, her fingers fidgeting nervously. She glanced at Mason, then at the glowing console in front of her, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she began to speak, her voice halting and broken but full of emotion. "Kalari. Me. From. Tharanis." She gestured upward, indicating space. "Rodhacks. Come. Take. Many. Gone." Mason's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar stories before. The Rodhacks were infamous for raiding vulnerable planets, enslaving populations, and stripping worlds of their resources. Tharanis, it seemed, had been one of their victims. Kalari continued, her voice trembling. "They. Make. Test." She tapped her chest again. "Put. Key. Say. Open. Vault." "Vault?" Mason repeated, leaning forward. "What kind of vault?" Kalari struggled to find the words, her frustration evident. She made a sweeping gesture, as if to encompass something vast. "Old. Big. Power." Mason frowned, piecing it together. The Rodhacks had implanted her with some kind of genetic key, a means to access ancient technology. But why abandon her if she was so important? They leave. Me, Kalari said, as if reading his thoughts. Her voice grew quieter, tinged with pain. Say, broken, useless. Mason's hands clenched into fists. They just threw you away? His voice was sharper than he intended, and Kalari flinched slightly. Sorry, Mason said quickly, softening his tone. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at them. What they did to you, it's unforgivable. Kalari nodded, though her eyes remained downcast. Mason reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her violet eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're not useless, Mason said firmly. You survived. That means you're stronger than they thought. Kalari blinked, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. She placed her hand over his, squeezing it gently. Before Mason could say more, the ship's alarms blared again. Juniper's calm voice cut through the tension. Warning, Rodhack's vessels detected. 3 ships, closing fast. Mason swore under his breath, pulling his hand back as he turned to the controls. They found us already? How the hell dash? Likely tracking device embedded in the Rodhack's technology within Kalari, Juniper replied. Recommendation. Evasive action immediately. Mason shot a glance at Kalari, who looked horrified. She clutched her chest as if willing the glow to stop. Mason's mind raced as he scanned the ship systems. Juniper, can you isolate the tracker? He asked. Negative, Juniper replied. The signal is too deeply integrated with her physiology. Damn it, Mason muttered. He turned to Kalari. They're using the key inside you to find us. We need to shake them before they catch up. Kalari nodded, her fear giving way to determination. Mason admired her resilience, even in the face of relentless danger. Juniper, plot a course to the asteroid field in Sector 7, Mason ordered. If we can lose them in there, we'll have time to figure this out. Course plotted, Juniper replied. The ship lurched as Mason pushed the engines to their limits. The Rodhack's vessels appeared on the sensors, closing in rapidly. Mason gritted his teeth, his hands flying over the controls as he prepared for another fight. The asteroid field loomed ahead, a sprawling labyrinth of tumbling rocks and debris. Mason dove into the field without hesitation, weaving through the dense formations with practiced precision. The Rodhack's fighters followed, their sleek frames more maneuverable but less durable. Hold on tight, Mason shouted as the ship banked sharply to avoid a massive asteroid. Kalari clung to her seat, her violet eyes wide as she watched Mason navigate the chaotic terrain. The Rodhacks opened fire, their plasma blasts carving through the asteroids around them. Mason used the debris to his advantage, forcing the enemy ships to waste their shots on the unstable rocks. One of the fighters collided with an asteroid, exploding in a fiery burst. 2 down, Mason muttered. 1 to go. The final Rodhack's fighter pursued relentlessly, its weapons lighting up the darkness of the asteroid field. Mason pushed his ship harder, the engines straining as he executed a series of evasive maneuvers. Juniper, prepare the railgun, Mason said. We'll need to make this count. Railgun charging, Juniper replied. Mason lined up the shot, his heart pounding. The Rodhack ship fired again, the blast narrowly missing the cockpit. Mason fired the railgun, the projectile tearing through the enemy ship and reducing it to a cascade of debris. Kalari let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. Mason glanced at her, offering a small smile. We're not out of this yet, he said, but that should buy us some time. As the ship emerged from the asteroid field, Mason set a course for a nearby neutral outpost. He knew the Rodhacks wouldn't give up, but he also knew he couldn't keep running forever. We'll figure this out, Mason said, his voice steady. Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore. Kalari looked at him, her expression softening. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason nodded, his resolve strengthening. Whatever the Rodhacks wanted, they weren't going to get it. Not as long as he had anything to say about it. Chapter 4. The Key to Survival. The neutral outpost loomed in the distance, a haphazard assembly of domes and towers built into the jagged surface of an asteroid. Known as Haven's Edge, it was a lawless haven for smugglers, mercenaries, and anyone looking to stay off the grid. For Mason, It was the perfect place to regroup and figure out their next move. For Kalari, it was the closest thing to safety she'd known in weeks. The docking clamps hissed as Mason's ship settled onto the landing platform. He powered down the engines and turned to Kalari, who sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her violet eyes darted nervously toward the viewport. "This place isn't exactly friendly," Mason said, his voice gentle but firm. "Stay close to me, and don't trust anyone." Kalari nodded, her fear evident but tempered by the trust she'd placed in him. Mason grabbed his plasma pistol and secured it in its holster, then motioned for her to follow. As the ship's hatch opened, the stale, metallic air of Haven's Edge filled the cabin. The outpost was bustling with activity. Alien merchants shouted over one another, peddling their wares in a cacophony of languages. Hardened mercenaries loitered near the cantina, their weapons displayed openly as warnings. The air was thick with tension, the kind that could erupt into violence at the slightest provocation. Kalari stayed close to Mason, her slight frame almost hidden behind his broad shoulders. Her gaze darted around, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. Mason kept a hand near his pistol, his eyes scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. They made their way to a small, dimly lit cantina tucked into the corner of the outpost. Mason led Kalari to a secluded booth, his back to the wall as he observed the room. Kalari slid into the seat across from him, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. "We need answers," Mason said, leaning forward. "If the Rothhacks are after this key, we need to figure out what it does and why it's so important." Kalari hesitated before nodding. She placed a hand over her chest, where the faint glow still pulsed beneath her skin. "Key. Open. Big. Power. Old." "Old power," Mason repeated, his brow furrowing. "Ancient technology, maybe? Something the Rothhacks think they can use?" Kalari nodded, her expression pained. "They test me, hurt me, say, key is broken." Mason's jaw tightened. The thought of what she'd endured made his blood boil. "Well, if it's broken, why are they still after you?" Kalari hesitated, then shook her head. "I not know." Before Mason could respond, a gruff voice interrupted them. "You look like a man with problems." Mason's hand moved instinctively to his pistol as a figure approached their booth. The newcomer was a tall, wiry alien with dark, leathery skin and piercing amber eyes. He wore a patchwork of armor, and a variety of weapons hung from his belt. Despite his intimidating appearance, he offered a toothy grin. "Relax," the alien said, holding up his hands. "Name's Brow. I hear things. Might be I can help you, for the right price." Mason eyed him warily. "And what makes you think we need help?" Brow's grin widened. "Because you've got a Rothak-sized problem, and that glowing friend of yours is the reason why." Kalari stiffened, her hand clutching Mason's sleeve. Mason placed a reassuring hand over hers, his gaze never leaving Brow. "Talk," Mason said. Brow slid into the booth, his movements relaxed but deliberate. "The Rothhacks are chasing you because of what's inside her," he said, nodding toward Kalari. "That key she's carrying? It's not just old, it's ancient. Precursor tech, from a race that vanished 1,000,000 years ago. Whatever it unlocks, it's big enough to make the Rothhacks risk everything to get it." Mason frowned. "If it's that important, why'd they abandon her in the first place?" See, that's the interesting part," Brow said, leaning forward. "The key's not just a thing, it's alive. It's tied to her biology. If they couldn't control her, they figured she was a lost cause." Kalari's eyes widened, her hand moving to her chest. "Alive?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Brow nodded. "Alive, and maybe smarter than the bastards who put it in you. It's probably the reason you're still breathing." Mason's mind raced. If the key was sentient, it might explain why the Rothhacks couldn't use it without Kalari. But it also meant they'd stop at nothing to get her back. And what happens if they get their hands on her? Mason asked. Brow's expression turned grim. If the key falls into Rothhack's hands, they'll use it to access precursor tech. Weapons, ships, maybe even something worse. You think they're bad now? Give them a fleet of precursor dreadnoughts, and they'll make the galaxy their playground. Mason swore under his breath. So what do we do? Brow leaned back, his grin returning. There's a vault, hidden on a dead planet not far from here. If you can get her there, The key will unlock it and destroy itself in the process. No key, no Rot-Hack's problem. Kalari looked to Mason, her expression uncertain. Destroy. Me? No, Mason said firmly. We're not doing this if it puts her at risk. The key will go. Not her, Browl said. But you'd better move fast. Rot-Hack's forces are already on their way. Mason's jaw tightened. Of course they are. The journey to the vault was tense and silent, the ship's sensors on high alert for Rot-Hack's ships. Kalari sat beside Mason in the cockpit, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She glanced at him occasionally, her violet eyes filled with unspoken questions. You don't have to do this, Mason said softly. If there's another way, I must, Kalari said, her voice steady despite her fear. For all. Mason nodded, his respect for her growing with each passing moment. She wasn't just surviving, she was choosing to fight back, to end the Rot-Hack's pursuit once and for all. As they approached the dead planet, the ship's alarms blared. Rot-Hack's ships appeared on the sensors, closing in fast. Hold on, Mason shouted as he dove into the planet's atmosphere. The ship rattled violently, the heat of re-entry turning the viewport into a blinding inferno. Plasma blasts streaked past them, and Mason pushed the ship to its limits. The surface of the planet was a desolate wasteland, dotted with towering structures that seemed to defy time. Mason guided the ship toward the largest structure, a massive tower that pulsed faintly with energy. That's it, Browl's voice crackled over the comms. Get her to the core. Mason landed the ship as close as he could, then helped Kalari down the ramp. The Rot-Hack's fighters circled above, their weapons firing indiscriminately. Go! Mason shouted, shielding Kalari as they ran toward the tower. Inside, the air was cold and still, the walls glowing faintly with alien glyphs. Kalari hesitated, then placed her hand on a glowing panel. The glyphs lit up, and the tower began to hum with energy. Hurry! Mason urged as the Rot-Hack's forces breached the entrance. Kalari stepped into the core chamber, where a massive console awaited. The glow in her chest grew brighter as she approached, and the key seemed to resonate with the ancient technology. Activate it, Mason shouted, holding off the advancing Rot-Hack's with his plasma pistol. Kalari placed her hand on the console, and the room erupted in light. The Rot-Hack's screamed as the energy overwhelmed them, disintegrating their forces in an instant. The key pulsed one final time, then faded. Kalari staggered, and Mason caught her. You did it, he said, his voice filled with relief. Kalari looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. We did. As they emerged from the tower, the planet was silent once more. The Rot-Hack's were gone, and the key was no more. Mason helped Kalari back to the ship, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. You're free now, he said as they prepared to leave. Kalari placed her hand over his, her violet eyes shining with gratitude. Thanks. To you. As the ship lifted off, Mason couldn't help but smile. They had survived, and for the first time, the future felt bright.